Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Inga Hansen, editor of Metaesthetics Magazine, and we're going to go ahead and get started. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can type them into the question box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. Today, we'll be talking about how non-prescription topical ingredients can help support the skin's natural reparative processes to reverse and prevent the signs of aging without irritation. Our presenter is dermatologist Carl Thornfeldt. Dr. Thornfeldt has been in private practice for 35 years and has been researching abnormalities of the skin barrier, cutaneous inflammation, drug delivery, herbs, and disease therapies for more than 20 years. He holds 22 U.S. patents, has published more than 40 scientific articles, and is the founder and CEO of EpiSciences, the makers of the FAAD skincare line. Welcome, Dr. Thornfeldt.
Thank you, Inga, for that introduction, and thank you all for taking the time to attend this session today. Hopefully you'll be intrigued as I am with the processes that I'll be discussing today. So my background is that, sorry, we're having a little change here in the anyway, my background, I grew up on a sheep ranch that also had vegetable gardens and fruit orchards. My father was a pediatrician and allergist, so I had a great interest in natural processes from the time I was young. And in my college years at Oregon State University, my chemistry professor was Linus Pauling. So we did work with vitamin C. One of my earliest research projects was with aloe vera. Then I did residency at UC San Diego with Dr. Richard Stoughton, and one of our research projects was the Stoughton vasoconstrictor assay and the development of a topical Cleocin T. And then later on did research with Drs. Maybach and Peter Elias, where we did a lot of this basic research. So I've been fortunate to stand on the broad shoulders of some great giants in the dermatology arena. We're going to cover inflammation, barrier repair, damage and disease skin, as well as the new paradigm for treatment, and then the evidence-based medicine behind these concepts. As you know, the major function of the skin is protection. There are these other functionalities as well. All being skincare professionals, you understand those, but the key is the protection aspect. So why has skin cancer become such an epidemic that 2 million Americans had surgery for it last year and over 15,000 died? Why has the incidence of chronic skin disease tripled in the last 50 years, so that now 2 out of every 5 adults will be afflicted at least once a month, for 1 month every 5 years with some kind of skin condition? Why has the incidence of childhood dermatitis tripled in the last 25 years? Why has hand dermatitis become the second leading cause of lost days of work? We also know that if we look at the burden of skin diseases nationwide, that dermatitis accounts for 1/3 of all the adult skin diseases, and sensitive skin afflicts 30 to 50% of adult females, depending on the race, and pruritus is the 14th most common skin diseases. The common denominator of all these conditions is the protective skin barrier is deteriorating, plus inflammation is increasing. So let's look at the drivers. Now, when I trained at UC San Diego, and before I went out into practice, I had thought the reason people didn't get well is because the doctor wasn't smart enough in his particular subject of specialty interest. And after being out in practice as the only dermatologist for 30-some thousand square miles in eastern Oregon and western Idaho, which is high desert. Our elevation is above a half a mile above sea level, and we have 110 degrees in the winter and 20 below zero in the winter, and then 110 to 115 above in the summer. With these variations, after about being in practice 18 months, I was sufficiently humbled about why people weren't getting well. And 2 of the clinical conundrums that I faced was polymorphous light eruption and asteatotic dermatitis. And as I observed these conditions, it didn't really seem to make much difference on what we did for treatment, whether spontaneous resolution would occur in the seasonal settings. And in fact, as I examined these patients further and realized that what was happening, that they caused spontaneous resolution of these two diseases by inducing stratum corneum barrier thickening and increased sebum production, both having an impact, obviously, on the skin barrier and the underlying inflammation. So I wondered if we could optimize the skin structure by upregulating the normal repair mechanisms and preventing the destructive processes. Could we ameliorate the visible skin aging, skin cancer, and skin diseases? However, Dr. Stoughton had taught us that it was the stratum corneum was nothing more than a cellophane barrier that you had to blow through. So I started questioning that as I had observed these changes with polymorphous light eruption and xerotic eczema. So in June of 1989, with Peter Elias, we set up a basic research focus group focusing on the stratum corneum barrier, the epidermis, and the basement membrane zone. So let's look at these components. So let's look at what was known at the time for cutaneous science. Stratum corneum barrier disruption in and of itself will cause release of not only IL-1, but also IL-8, IL-12, tumor necrosis factor alpha, substance P, calcium ions, TGF-beta, and a variety of growth factors. So that in and of itself would activate that repair process of inflammation that was necessary for the acute inflammation for repair. So we need to make that distinction between the two types of inflammation, and we're focusing on here on the reparative type. But then in 1988, Lafter and Kligman of Retinoid fame published an interesting article showing that there was lymphomononuclear infiltrate with many mast cells in aged skin. And they also showed that frequently those mast cells were in direct contact with fibroblasts. And these are pictures from their original publications. So even though other people are claiming to be the father of inflammation and skin aging, these were the true guys. And Lafter and Kligman were the first ones that presented that, and then we substantiated that with our research 8 years later. Now, what happens in the setting of inflammation? So we'll look at ear here, and we activate it with 4-ball ester, and you can see the tremendous amount of inflammation that occurs. So if we then look at ways to modulate this inflammation, we look at dexamethasone, a well-known steroid, and you can see where it could return to a much more normal state. But when we compared it with our herbal extracts, where we had specifically looked at a variety of extracts and then created herbal formula, which I will share with you more detail later, you can see that not only we were statistically superior to dexamethasone, but how normal it looked. So going back to the other slide, you compare the normal ear to this treated ear, and there's a tremendous amount of a normality in the treated ear using this product. So then if we look at the harshest hypersensitivity model, which is the dinitrofluorobenzene model, we found that if we compared it with mometasone ointment and with hydrocortisone, you can see that even with hydrocortisone, there was no suppression of the inflammatory response. With mometasone, we had about a 40% suppression, but with the herbal test product, we had a 44%. So it was not quite statistically significant, but there was a trend towards statistical significance in superiority there. So then we looked at tumor necrosis factor secretion, and we found using 4 different herbal blends that had variations in the amount of active ingredients and the active herbs. You can see that not only are there differences in response, but most importantly, you see a definite pharmacologic effect. In other words, a dose-response effect with these products on release of tumor necrosis factor alpha, and that's on peripheral blood human monocytes. And then we looked at IL-2 because that was a lot more stable agent to look at than IL-1. Again, you can see at higher concentrations than in the previous test for TNF, but nevertheless, there is a pharmacologic benefit from these different herbal products. So then we looked at human skin. So we looked at 2 MMPs, gelatinase A and B, and we compared it with dexamethasone, and you can see in this that for gelatinase A, the results were identical. So the herbal test product was equal to dexamethasone in inhibiting gelatinase A matrix metalloproteinase. When we looked at gelatinase B, it wasn't quite as good. There was not a statistical significance, but there was a trend toward statistical inferiority against gelatinase B, but nevertheless, measurable benefit, as you can see, against the vehicle control, indicating profound activity. So then we looked at soap chamber test, and what we do is put the solvent materials and watch it for 5 days and treat, and we measure the amount of erythema, and we found that we could more than triple the reduction in erythema by using that herbal test lipids in this soap chamber. Again, indicating the power of this activity in human skin. When we looked at other non-physiologic lipids for barrier repair, we tested with transepidermal water loss. Now, transepidermal water loss is a measure of stratum corneum permeability barrier function. So if there's 100% transepidermal water loss, it means there's no barrier function at all. 0% TEWL means that the barrier is completely intact. And you can see how the vehicle was after we stripped off the stratum corneum. And it didn't matter whether we used laser, whether we used acetone, or whether we used chemical peels. We still had these same kind of results. And so you can see that 10% petrolatum has, in this assay, about a 47% function of transepidermal water loss remaining. In other words, a 53% improvement. But then you go down to lanolin. You can see that the improvement is even greater. It's all the way down to about 22% transepidermal water loss, so 78% improvement. And then when we mix the three together at these concentrations, then you can see that that produced the best effect on transepidermal water loss. And that indicated that each one of these compounds was working by a different mechanism, suggesting that just as inflammation is complex, so is the barrier repair pathways. But the other thing to notice is the concentrations here. You know, when people talk about greases, they're usually talking about 50% or higher petrolatum levels. And here you could see significant improvement just with a 10% concentration. So one of the fallacies of petrolatum is that you need very high doses to have barrier function, and we'll show you later that that's in fact not the case. But then we wondered about how much of a role does skin hydration play? Because we know the roughness of the skin in aged skin not only indicates that there's some probable disruption of the barrier, but we wondered if with the dryness that occurs with that roughness, whether reversing that with increasing water holding capacity of skin would in fact be clinically beneficial. So skin capacitance is a measurement of the water holding capacity, in other words, the hydration, which is synonymous with moisture, but that is not synonymous with barrier repair, okay? So it's important to understand that. Now, we showed here that we did increase hydration more than 7-fold by putting this particular herbal lipid base on the skin. Then we also did a study against prescription lachydrin, which was at the time the most potent hydrator of the skin. The most potent non-prescription hydrator of the skin was Lubriderm, and we compared our lotion against that. And with a single application, you can see that we were statistically superior to Lubriderm at 4 hours and at 12 hours, and statistically superior to lachydrin also at 12 hours. We continued the study with twice daily application for another 3 days, then we stopped it. 24 hours after that last application, well, we then measured the levels here, and you can see that the lachydrin and the moisturization were comparable, but statistically superior over Lubriderm. As we followed along to get through another 72-hour period. So by day 8, we found that we were statistically superior to lachydrin and lubriderm again, but that our level of activity maintained even for 4 days with no applications of the particular product, indicating a significant prolonged effect and indicating that there were greater lasting effects here throughout the epidermis, stratum corneum, and basal membrane zone. All right, so then we looked at other diseases to see which were characterized by skin barrier disruption and chronic inflammation, and which ones could be flared by changes in that. And we found that the intrafollicular barrier abnormality actually was the triggering inflammation pathway in acne. And of course, when we first reported this back in the 90s, people were extremely skeptical about that. But more and more data is coming in showing that how acne really is an inflammatory-driven process, and a lot of that is down in the follicle. But also notice that besides PMLE, we also see rosacea and even melasma. That's one reason why melasma is so difficult to treat, is because there are these other 2 abnormalities and why there's a very rapid rebound, which I'll show you with some of the traditional treatments later on in our evidence-based medicine section. Sensitive skin is characterized by occult barrier disruption and chronic inflammation. And then, of course, the signs of extrinsic skin aging and various types of dermatitis are all related to these abnormalities. So this whole list occurs. Keratosis pilaris obviously is down in the follicle. The ichthyoses are also related to disorders. They are disorders of cornification, but again, characterized by these abnormalities, which means then that working on these 2 foundational problems should have a great impact in a very significant amount of the population that we see today in our practices. So let's look at the barrier repair process. So we know that stratum corneum barrier integrity is really important. Dr. Elias was our academic head of our research group, and he published in '92 some of our earliest work that barrier function regulates keratinocyte DNA synthesis in the epidermis, and it didn't matter how the barrier function was compromised, it would still trigger that DNA synthesis that would then result, obviously, in the basal cell proliferation. Then later published with others in our group, including Ken Feingold, that multiple chronic inflammatory diseases are characterized and flared by a disrupted stratum corneum barrier. We know that the barrier disruption activates and releases the endogenous inflammatory factors, which I mentioned earlier, but it also allows the pro-inflammatory environmental insults to penetrate deeper and in larger amounts to drive damage and prevent repair. So the inflammation is critical. As I mentioned already, the article by Kligman and Lavker back in 1988 that it does produce certain signs of skin aging, and then I wrote the definitive article on that was published in Journal of Cosmetic Dermatology 10 years ago, that the major driver for extrinsic skin aging is in fact chronic inflammation. But that chronic inflammation can be driven by the barrier disruption. So the name of the game, damaged, diseased skin of the common abnormalities that we see today in the clinic are directly related to the following processes. The chronic inflammation activates multiple inflammatory cascades, which upregulates MMPs, destroying not only the fibers, but also the extracellular matrix, damaging the key cells and so on in the epidermis. So this is the cartoon of putting it all into one schematic here. And you can see all the different inflammatory processes, pro-inflammatory processes, and the situation occurring of people walking around today that are associated with barrier disruption. So anything that activates barrier disruption can then activate 5 pathways of inflammation, okay? But there are also 2 other inflammatory pathways as well. We found in the research that if you would block one or two or three of those pathways, there would be shunting of signals down other pathways, and at the end of the day, there would be a significant upregulation of matrix metalloproteinases. And once you got beyond that acute inflammation phase of 14 to 21 days, then you would get an imbalance of the MMPs and their tissue inhibitors. So the MMPs are so dominant that they will then activate dysplasia, which we see as actinic keratoses in skin cancer. They would activate microscars, which progress into fine lines, wrinkles, and furrows, and they activate further inflammatory pathways, or I should say magnify the inflammatory pathways, so that you get activation of a variety of skin diseases and skin sensitivity. Okay, and we reasoned that if we could restore the barrier, strengthen the barrier to make it more resistant to these environmental factors, and we could modulate every single one of these 7 inflammatory pathways here, could we in fact prevent the MMP problem and the MMP imbalance? Now, to show you in perspective, other anti-aging products do modulate these pathways and do have some effect. Nobody doubts that AHAs have some benefit. Nobody doubts that retinoids have some benefit, but they work in a small portion of the total pathways here. And those can be overridden relatively easily by the cells, and that's, of course, what results then in tachyphylaxis. In other words, when you continue using the product for a long period of time, it becomes less effective in its response. And that was one of the areas of research that I was involved with Dr. Stoughton, and was the whole tachyphylaxis aspect, which meant then that forced us to go to the herbal arena, because we could not find synthetic ingredients that we could mix together that would produce stable blends that would not irritate patients and that would not develop tachyphylaxis. So we went to the herbal arena, screened 130 different herbs, and in fact, we looked at how do these herbs modulate these different pathways. Now, we did 6 extracts of all these different herbs at different concentrations and different pHs, and found how these actually worked in which particular of these pathways. So then we made those, we figured out what concentrations were required. Could we deliver them to the target site, whether it be in the stratum corneum, at the epidermis, in the basal cells, or down in the basal membrane zone, and then develop those formulations. Okay. Now, of the 240 documented anti-inflammatory herbs, there's only a handful, so 25, that we actually proved that had anti-inflammatory effect in these particular pathways. So as I said, we screened 130. These are the ones that will modulate different aspects of these pathways. Notice that soy isn't on the list, teas are not on the list. Why? They were not potent enough. So for example, our flax extract was 800 times more potent than soy. Our date extract was significantly more potent than the green tea extract. So we found out what it was that actually produced the optimum function. So all extracts are not the same. The method of extraction, the original source, the way it's formulated are all critical for functionality of herbs. And that's why our particular herbs, we have done safety studies as well to show that we don't increase the risk of contact dermatitis, which is important because we're focusing on damage and diseased skin. So let's look at the environmental insults. So these 6 compounds that are used in skincare products and prescription medications are documented to not only have caused damage to the stratum corneum barrier and increase its permeability, hence they're good for the delivery of other types of active ingredients, but they also stimulate release of TNF-alpha, even at concentrations below barrier destruction. So early on, they are pro-inflammatory, okay? And so that's been difficulty in formulation, is to get high enough concentrations of active ingredients to override this inherent pro-inflammatory nature of these particular molecules. So then does it make sense that that's something you should be using over the long term, and that's actually going to produce the optimum repair of your skin? You know, when we were doing all this steroid work, and we'd have patients, our early high potency steroids would have a 56% inhibition, and you know, drug companies say, hey, that's great. You guys have really done something outstanding here. The problem was I never had a patient come in and want to get 56% better. They all want to get 100% clear, okay? And so even though these other compounds will have some anti-aging benefit, is that what's going to produce the optimum benefit? And I submit it's working on the underlying foundational abnormalities that will give you your optimum benefit. Now, other environmental insults, as you may or may not be aware of, Dr. Krupman published in December of 2016 research from Dusseldorf, from the European Institute of Pollution Research, and showed that airborne pollutants, particularly nano and micronized soot, dioxin, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, and hydrogen dioxide, so those three gases and the two types of soot, would activate the aryl hydroxyl receptor pathway even to a greater degree, a much greater degree than ultraviolet light did. And that plays a role not only in cutaneous skin aging, but also in malignancy and neoplasia as well. There are other factors here that play a role, and another group published in the spring of 2016 that ambient temperature above 99 degrees Fahrenheit in and of itself could trigger a pathway that would result in barrier damage and inhibit barrier repair, as well as open follicular orifices, so there's deeper penetration of the pollutants as well as the environmental stressors. You can see the list of the other factors that play a role, particularly physical and emotional stress can also have a huge impact. So what's the new approach to skin aging? The new paradigm to reverse common skin disorders, including skin aging, so all those other 12 diseases that I talked about, as well as skin aging, is to rapidly return a disrupted stratum corneum barrier to optimum permeability and to maintain this optimum state. Also, we need to reverse epidermal and dermal chronic inflammation, but without compromising barrier integrity and not activating the pro-inflammatory biologic response modifiers. All right, so that's all neat science, Dr. Thornfeldt, but can you show me the money? How do we know it actually works? Well, the name of the game then to show something actually works is evidence-based medicine. In other words, double-blinded, prospective, controlled human clinical trials against a placebo or an approved prescription product conducted by a third-party research group and approved by an institutional review board, but using the finished product. In 2016, I was walking the floor at the American Academy of Dermatology and went to all 38 cosmeceutical companies that were displaying at the time. There was only one other company besides Epionce who claimed to have any clinical studies and could actually show a clinical study with the finished product. 6 other companies claimed clinical studies, but when I got a hold of the studies, they actually had been conducted by a research group like NIH, where they did a formulation that included just propylene glycol, ethanol, and water, or something along those lines, and said, hey, this ingredient works. Well, you know, we all know from medical school that chemistry happens, and when you mix all these different ingredients together, particularly reactive ingredients, whether it be AHAs or retinoids or other types of factors, chemistry occurs in that formulation. So it's only valid if the finished product is tested. All right, so this research I'm showing you is with our finished product, the same product we ask you to sell to Mrs. Jones, and you here's the expected activity, and here's the science behind it. So we know that this particular product really does work in these patients. Now, in addition, we also did safety studies on all of ours. Safety and efficacy studies are absolutely not required for cosmetics and for these over-the-counter products. But we do them anyway because I feel that as a doctor and practicing medicine, dermatology 3.5 days a week, that I still need to use the same criteria that I use for prescriptions. In other words, is it effective and is it safe for that particular disease? So that's the criteria that I use in my practice. And so it seemed to me that for these skincare products, we should have the same criteria. So we do safety studies with repeat insult patch tests. So even though many people have been raising concerns about botanicals, we have had positive tests for safety that we don't cause irritation and sensitization in the vast majority of patients. And incidence is actually less than 0.1% of having any problems. So now, obviously, as a doctor, I would like every product to be 100%, but as you know, that just doesn't happen. So let's look at the anti-inflammatory component, the one we selected to go in the Renewal product, and you can see that 6 hours after activation of inflammation, comparing our Epions, which is on the top line, with 100% petrolatum in the middle and hydrocortisone in the inferior line, that in fact we were statistically significantly superior. Now let's put this in context. So high potency steroids like fluocinolone have will produce a level of 42 to 44. Mid potency steroids like mometasone and triamcinolone will be in the mid 30s. So you can see that we had very significant activity and did a variety of tests to prove we just didn't produce a new steroid. But we decided to do contact dermatitis induced by retinoids to see if this formula, if the Renewal formulation would actually work. And we compared in this the one at the top there that's going off to the right, meaning that it worsened, is a commercial moisturizer. And you can see that there was no relief of the inflammation from that. The second line down is hydrocortisone, and this is a 2.5% hydrocortisone. And then the second to the bottom there is the mometasone, the prescription mometasone, and then the Renewal facial cream. And you can see that we were statistically superior to the mometasone as well as to 2.5% hydrocortisone in a test reversing contact dermatitis induced by retinoids. We also showed actually we enhanced the benefit of retinoids in their anti-aging as well as inhibited the inflammation. Then we compared it with hydration, compared again the 12% lacthydrin, just looking at hydration factors, and compared it with a commercial moisturizer and then our face cream and our body lotion. You can see there was no statistical difference between the body lotion, face cream, and lacthydrin in hydration only. But as I said, that does not correlate with barrier function. So then we did a clinical trial. We did 2 clinical trials with Renewal facial cream and compared in those results against published results from 8% glycolic acid, 10% polyhydroxy acid, and 1% kynotin that were all presented at the American Academy of Dermatology, the same one that we rolled out these 2 clinical studies. And you can see that our numbers were very favorable, with about a 50% better result on against the 10% polyhydroxy acid and the glycolic acid on for fine lines, and also better for wrinkles as well, and improvement in roughness. So clearly beneficial, and so then we felt that we needed to take on the gold standard. But before we did that, there had been a publication on a growth factor product where they showed that after 6 months of use, there was one parameter in optical profilometry, in other words, a measurement of roughness of the skin that reached statistical significance. Now, in that same paper, they stated that the dermatologist investigators did not see any clinical change over the 6 months of use with that product. So we decided to test this, and of course the optical profilometry research group came to us and said, well, you got a problem, Dr. Thornfeldt, and that is that in your clinical studies, your patients, you can actually see a difference. And I said, well, I understand that, but I want to compare with what these other companies that are saying that you should use their product because there is optical profilometry benefit. I want to show how much better we are. And obviously here at 8 weeks, we were statistically superior at all parameters at that 8-week time point instead of a 6-month time point, again, showing probable superiority. So then we decided to take on the market leader, which Renova 0.05% emollient tretinoin had recently been approved as the first anti-wrinkling product approved by the FDA. And so we compared Renova with our lactic acid moisturizer. Now I realized we were taking a big risk, but I felt that since this concept of barrier repair and anti-inflammatory was an entirely new way to look at the problem, that if I really believed in that, I should have the courage to take on this clinical trial. Fortunately, my wife, now 44 years, agreed, and we were able to finance this clinical study. And you can see then in a 6-month trial using their Renova 0.05 and lactic acid moisturizer compared to our Renewal facial cream twice a day and our Lytic once a day. You can see that the epidermal parameters, 5 of the 7 epionts had a numerical superiority. Now, the reason I bring this up is because there's recently been introduction of another product line where they're touting the fact that they have a superactive retinoid and a much more stable hydroxy acid and use their product. Well, that was great, but 15 years ago we proved that our concept was superior to the retinoid hydroxy acid concept. Now, you can see these pictures here, the definite softening on the forehead lines, and there was no other treatment done during this time. So they had no other lasers, no chemical peels, nothing else, purely these topical products. You can see definite improvement there in the marionette lines. Okay, so, but then when we looked at other factors, so we looked at the chemistry and we on biopsies, and we found that our epidermal glycosaminoglycan content, that we were nearly double the Renova amount of epidermal gags. Now, it turned out that some other researchers in Austria found that it was fractions of these epidermal gags diffusing through the epidermis and basement membrane zone into the papillary dermis that would activate fibroblasts to stimulate the extracellular matrix. And here we showed then, so when we looked at this, we had increased numbers of gags, about twice. As a matter of fact, it was a statistically significant increase. But then when we looked at dermal density on ultrasound, we could see that our dermal density was more than twice, and to a p-value of 0.001. So we were highly statistically superior, twice as effective as the Renova lactic acid moisturizer in dermal density. So that's why from the very beginning, when we introduced epionts, we had a 2% concentration of a variety of lengths of hyaluronic acids that we understood how they would be fractionated and then in the skin, and then would diffuse down into the dermis to have dermal impacts. And we proved it in this clinical trial that we were twice as good as the gold standard. Obviously, then you would expect that marked improvement, twice as good a result in reducing furrows, fine lines, and also wrinkles, both coarse and fine wrinkles. All right. So then the question is, did that work in everybody, Dr. Thornfeldt? Well, in my practice, since I practice 3.5 days a week, my patients hold me accountable. And if something doesn't work very well, they absolutely let me know. And they all know where my house is, and where my llamas are and everything else. And so I have to make sure that my patient population is pleased with the products that they use. And we had a minority of patients, about 10 to 15%, that just weren't getting as good a result as we'd like to see. So we looked at the fibroblasts and their keratinocytes, and found that those cells could just not do what we were asking them to do. So we found barrier repairing potato peptide and yeast peptide, 3 and 4 amino acids that we could deliver to upregulate the synthesis of those of ceramides and of cholesterol, because that's where the deficiencies were. And we also were able to figure out a clever way to use azelaic acid to deliver triterpenoids, and we put that product called the Intensive Nourishing Cream. So we tested that against the most potent antioxidant, which is the Epidermal, and you can see at 6 weeks we were 3 times as good in shallow wrinkles, twice as good in hyperpigmentation and laxity. By 12 weeks, again, more than double the dermal benefits and triple again in the shallow wrinkles, indicating that this strategy was clearly superior to the most potent antioxidants. What about other treatments? Well, we looked at a lytic product that was designed to compete against benzoyl peroxides, but without producing irritation in patients with acne. And it has the 4 comedolatic antimicrobials that are over-the-counter drugs. We combined them into this lytic formulation, and in this clinical trial, we can see that even at day 6, we had superior reduction in lesion size and elevation, which were all superior to 10% benzoyl peroxide in 30-something women with mild to moderate acne. And we showed that at 12 weeks, lesions were decreased by 51%. Now, as you recall, it's been published that minocycline 100 milligrams daily for 90 days will produce a reduction in inflammatory lesions by 51% as well. And 72% preferred our particular product. Then looking at actinic keratoses, we found a 62% reduction in visible lesion count. Now, we're not saying we're curing the actinic keratoses because we didn't do post-op biopsies or post-treatment biopsies, but we did show that we could remove the visible actinic keratoses. And this was the 5th clinical trial showing that we reduced that. As you saw in the Retinoid study against Renewal, we in fact had 100% resolution of the actinic keratoses in that particular clinical trial, as we found in 2 other clinical trials. Also, we found activity against actinic and senile comedones and sebaceous hyperplasia better than anything else on the market. So then we looked at these lytics for periocular wrinkling, thinking that if there's anti-inflammatory effect and pore cleansing effect, we should in fact see benefit, and in fact we did. A 48.3% reduction in periocular wrinkles after just 8 weeks of use. So I want to talk a bit about hyperpigmentation. So this is the complexity of the process. So you have your activation phase outside of the melanocyte, then all these steps within the melanocyte, and then the distribution phase again outside of the melanocyte. Well, since this is an ongoing process and the environmental damage is ongoing, your melanocyte and these processes will be at different stages of activation. In addition, when you put a compound on the skin, of course, there's going to be metabolism or at least catabolism of that ingredient, so it will have a finite time period. So depending on where you are in the process, if you use a tyrosinase inhibitor, yes, you're going to work in the middle stages there, but what about if the process is already beyond that, or the process is prior to that, and that tyrosinase inhibitor is destroyed prior to actually the activation of these pathways? So we decided to use the same strategy where we did for inflammation, where we inhibited the 7 inflammatory pathways, and the same process for barrier repair, where we upregulated the 5 barrier repair pathways, was to see if we could modulate every single one of these pathways. So then the question is, does it really work? So we did a clinical trial against the Obagi-Nuderm system, and for scaling and dryness, you can see that the Obagi-Nuderm system had a 200% worsening, whereas we had complete resolution with our Epion's product. And then with erythema, there was a 66% worsening of the erythema with the Obagi-Nuderm system, a transient 21% decrease, but none of them persisted on the Epion's product. So we looked at the 4 different types of hyperpigmentation. You can see there was a numerical superiority for mottled hyperpigmentation for the Obagi system. For melasma, there was a numerical superiority. And the others during the 12-week treatment phase were comparable. But when we also added a 6-week regression phase, we wanted to see what happened, because as you know, the big problem with treatment of hyperpigmentation is rapid rebound and severity of rebound. So we just sat tight for 6 weeks, and we found that the lentiginous that were treated with the Obagi Nuderm flared so badly that they were 31.2% worse than when they started. So yeah, you would have some improvement, but then you got a severe rapid rebound with that. We also noted that when we looked at specific sites of melasma, even though Epionce was numerically superior over the total global face, but you could see at the chin and the cheeks, we were definitely superior, and that superiority held, and most importantly, we did not get a significant rebound. So that's important for understanding, again, the long-term safety and our strategy for preventing tachyphylaxis, so that we don't get these types of rebounds. So then we did, and now that was in skin types 1 through 3. So then the question is, does it also work in skin type 4 through 6? About 40% of my practice is skin of color, so I felt that was really important to establish that. So we did a clinical trial, one in Los Angeles with Dr. Pearl Grimes, looking at Hispanic and Black American skin, and then another site with Dr. Neil Sadik in New York, looking at East Asian and Indian subcontinent Asian skin. So in this group of 58 patients, we were able to see significant benefits. Now, this hydroquinone 4% is one I had invented back in the 90s when we were doing lots of drug delivery technology to see if we could improve efficacy and reduce irritation. Because after all, the phase 3s to get hydroquinone approved, the highest success rate was 63%. Here on the Emexameter, we found that with this formulation, we can reduce the total melanin count by 90.9%. So then the last product is our Renewal Calming Cream. This is designed to treat eczema. Contains all the the physiologic lipids, the 3 T barrier lipids, cholesterol, ceramide, and free fatty acid in the proper ratios, in the proper concentrations, with some non-physiologic agents, glycerin and low potency, low concentration of petrolatum, but also has colloidal oatmeal with it. And we wanted to see how quickly this would work in reversing the eczema symptoms. And we found that by day 8, we had a 58.3% improvement in pruritus, and by day 22, 81.3%. Scaling and dryness, 57.8% at day 8, 67.5% at day 22, and erythema was reduced by 54.2% by day 22. Now, in the 22 patients that we treated, not everybody had exudation, but those that did had 100% resolution by day 22. And not everybody had excoriation, but those that did, 75% reduction in excoriations by day 22. But what's also important is that in treatment compared with steroids conducted by others, that using the barrier product produced a much longer lasting resolution of dermatitis than just the steroids where you would get a rapid rebound. So this is the newest product that we brought onto the into the marketplace. So in conclusion, there's a new paradigm for effective treatment of 12 common skin diseases and conditions with non-prescription products that are based in herbs, have proven safety and efficacy for skin aging, for dermatitis, for sensitive skin, hyperpigmentation, and pruritus. Moreover, this treatment is based on reversing the foundational pathophysiology of the compromised stratum corneum permeability barrier and the destructive chronic inflammation. Phew, thank you so much. And do any of you have any questions?
Yeah, Thank you so much, Dr. Thornfeldt. That was fabulous. We do have a couple questions coming in. We only have about 5 minutes, so if we don't get to your questions, Dr. Thornfeldt or I will follow up with you. But one question is, somebody is asking about diet and oral ingestion of things like omega-3s. Can they help support barrier function or improve the efficacy of topicals?
A good question. There's been a number of studies looking at that. Many of the people with omega-3s are claiming benefit, but the fact of the matter is the only study proving that there was improvement from ingesting was a combination of ingesting equal parts by weight of flax and borage oil, and that did have an improvement on that, on improving barrier function and sebum production. There are also studies showing that ingestion of certain anti-inflammatories, herbal anti-inflammatory teas, including spearmint tea, would be effective against acne. Ginger tea, rooibos tea, green tea, and white tea were shown to decrease symptoms and findings in dermatitis. And then pycnogenol, which is maritime pine extract orally, has been shown to reduce hyperpigmentation. And then since this is a dermatology audience, many of them are aware that oral niacinamide and oral azelaic acid also have been shown to improve a variety of these abnormalities, including hyperpigmentation and acne. And then finally, there was actually clinical trials with diet. So a modified Atkins diet was shown to reduce acne, and the South Beach diet was shown to reduce acne. Another study with rosacea, and another study with psoriasis. So dietary aspects are important. And so I personally am a big believer in supplementation and find that they are helpful. But unfortunately, with many of them, you have to take such large doses that many people have difficulty. And depending on what are the medications they're taking, you may have to adjust the dosages down. It has been shown recently, as I mentioned earlier, about the AHR receptor pathway, that also is associated with malignancy of the GI tract and the lung, and so the supplements that block those steps in the pathway are helpful in prevention of that, and that's particularly been studied with the pycnogenol.
Great. And there's another question asking about the Renewal Calming Cream and whether that might be effective for chronic seborrheic dermatitis, and can it be used on skin and scalp?
Well, it's the way it's formulated. It was formulated for glabrous skin. We don't. So, in other words, the non-hair bearing areas. We don't have a light lotion of that yet for the hairy areas, but absolutely it works in those areas because the 7 herbal extracts that we have in there are not only anti-inflammatory, but they are also antimicrobial. And as it's now being shown that many of these chronic skin conditions are driven by Malassezia furfur yeast, by varying amounts of Demodex folliculorum, and the sensitivity that those actually create with them, as well as the abnormal stratum corneum barrier. And so we included those in there. These herbal extracts in that particular product. So we have very good safety over the long term, and our RIPT test was negative on that. So it can be used in all ages, any body site, for prolonged periods of time.
Wonderful. And we have a couple more questions. I'm going to try and get to one more because we only have about 2 more minutes. So if we lose anybody, we will follow up if we weren't able to answer your questions live here. But somebody is asking, are the Epidermal products safe and helpful for patients who are post-radiation or chemotherapy who have compromised skin barriers?
Yeah, they're actually tremendous for that. We actually have a couple products that are very effective for that because you think about what happens in those conditions. The pathophysiology is an issue of severity of this. So what it means is you have to use the product more frequently and large. So say you use it 4 to 7 times a day instead of normally 2 to 4 times a day. But absolutely, it will reverse this damage, and it's been shown. We actually showed that it does not have an impact on reducing the effect of the radiation for the therapy of the underlying condition. It works purely on the barrier and the processes in the inflammation in the chronic radiation dermatitis. But we know that there's no adverse effect in reducing the therapeutic benefit of the radiation, but clearly not only prevents but will reverse chronic radiation dermatitis.
Well, that is great to know, and thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and wrap up because the webinar is coming to an end, but thank you so much for everyone for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Thornfeldt, for the great presentation.
Well, thank you all for joining today, and I hope you found that it's helpful and will help you in your practices.